Something just happened at the southern border of American power, and most people in this country have no idea what it actually means. Donald Trump, the man who built an entire political identity around never backing down, around being the toughest deal maker in the room, around making other countries bend to American will, just reversed course on Mexico, and not quietly, not with some technical footnote buried in a policy document that nobody reads, visibly, undeniably, in a way that every economist, every trade analyst, and every foreign government watching this situation was able to see clearly for exactly what it was, a capitulation. And on the other side of that moment stood Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's president, who did not flinch, did not beg, and did not accept the terms being forced on her country. She negotiated, she held her ground, and she walked away with a deal. So before you accept the spin that is already being packaged for your consumption, you need to understand what actually happened here and why it matters far more than the headline suggests. And so here we are again, another week, another dramatic reversal from the man who built his entire political identity on the idea that he alone could hold firm, that he alone had the spine, the nerve, the deal-making genius to never blink first. Donald Trump blinked, and not just a little. Not one of those quiet, technical policy adjustments that spin doctors can dress up in neutral language and slide past the public without too much noise. No, this was a full, visible, undeniable capitulation. And it happened because a woman on the other side of the southern border looked at the pressure being applied to her country, looked at the economic consequences her people were already beginning to feel, looked at the political theater being staged in Washington, and decided she was not going to play the role that had been written for her. Claudia Sheinbaum did not flinch. And that difference, and between the man who flinched and the woman who didn't, tells us something enormously important about where power actually lives in this moment in history, not just on the surface of who won a negotiation or who got the better trade terms, but deeper than that, about the structural forces that are reshaping what leverage means, what sovereignty means, and what it means when a country in the so-called global south sits down across the table from the most powerful economy in the world and walks away with a deal that reflects its own interests. Let me take you back to the beginning of this, because context matters here more than almost anything else. And one of the things that frustrates me most about how these stories get covered in the mainstream press is that they always start at the middle. They start at the dramatic moment, the press conference, the announcement, the headline, and they strip away everything that made that moment possible. They want you to focus on the personalities, on Trump being erratic, on Sheinbaum being composed. And sure, those things are real, those things matter in the immediate sense. But if you only focus on the personalities, you miss the machinery underneath. You miss the reason why one side had more leverage than the other. And that reason is never really about individual character. It's about structure. It's always about structure. So let's talk about what was actually happening in the lead up to this moment. The Trump administration came in, as it did in the first term, as it has done again, with what I would describe as a mercantilist fantasy. The idea that the United States could use tariffs as a weapon, could use the sheer gravitational pull of the American consumer market to extract concessions from every trading partner it had, and that those trading partners would ultimately have no choice but to comply. Because what were they going to do? Where were they going to go? The United States represents, depending on how you measure it, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of global GDP. The idea was that this fact alone would function as a kind of permanent trump card. And I use that word deliberately, that no matter how much bluster came from the other side, they would eventually fold, because the alternative was economic isolation. And for a country like Mexico, which sends the overwhelming majority of its exports to the United States, the theory seemed almost airtight. Mexico needs the American market. Therefore, Mexico will do what America says. It's simple. It's clean. It has the appeal of a logic puzzle with an obvious answer, except it isn't simple, and the answer isn't obvious. And anyone who has studied how economic relationships actually function, not in textbooks written to flatter the interests of dominant powers, but in the real world where supply chains are complicated and political constituencies have real weight and history leaves real marks, anyone who has studied this seriously knows that the relationship between the United States and Mexico is not a relationship between a master and a servant. It is a relationship between two economies that have become deeply, structurally, almost irreversibly intertwined. And when you are intertwined with someone at that level, threatening to cut the cord doesn't just hurt them, it hurts you. It hurts your farmers who depend on Mexican agricultural labor and Mexican consumer markets. It hurts your manufacturers who have built their supply chains across that border over decades in ways that cannot be undone in a quarterly earnings cycle. It hurts your automobile industry, which is not an American industry in any simple nationalist sense, but a North American industry that requires the cross-border movement of parts and components and skilled workers to function at all. Trump's team knew this, or should have known this, but knowing something and being politically able to act on that knowledge are two entirely different things. And Trump had made promises, loud, public, emphatic promises about tariffs, about borders, about making Mexico pay, about American dominance being reasserted in ways that his base could see and feel and celebrate. And so the administration moved forward with the tariff threats, even as the internal economic logic of those threats was always somewhat shaky. Now, on the Mexican side, here is what Claudia Sheinbaum inherited. She inherited a country that was already navigating an extraordinarily complicated transition. She took over from Lopez Obrador, who had his own complicated relationship with Trump, sometimes defiant, sometimes accommodating, always trying to protect Mexican sovereignty, while managing the enormous economic dependency that the NAFTA and then USMCA framework had cemented into place. She took over a country where the nearshoring boom, the massive wave of manufacturing investment flowing into Mexico as companies tried to reduce their dependence on China, had created genuine economic momentum, real leverage of a kind that Mexico had not possessed in quite the same way even 5 years earlier. Because here is the thing about nearshoring that the mainstream financial press covers as a straightforward, good news economic story, but that has much deeper implications. When American and European and Asian companies invest hundreds of billions of dollars in manufacturing capacity in Mexico, they are not doing Mexico a favor in the traditional sense of foreign direct investment flowing from the rich world to a dependent recipient. They are creating a situation in which their own profitability, their own supply chain security, their own ability to serve their shareholders depends on Mexico remaining stable, Mexico remaining a reliable production base, Mexico not being destabilized by the kind of punishing tariff regime that Trump was threatening, which means that Sheinbaum, when she walked into those negotiations, had a constituency of support that extended far beyond Mexico's borders. She had American corporations quietly terrified about what aggressive tariffs would do to their production costs and their competitive position. She had supply chain managers at major manufacturing companies doing the math and not liking what they were seeing. She had a whole ecosystem of economic interests that were structurally on her side, even if they couldn't say so publicly, because saying so publicly would mean defying the political moment in Washington. And Sheinbaum understood this. This is what I want you to appreciate about her approach, because it was genuinely sophisticated in a way that I think often goes unrecognized. She did not make the mistake of trying to match Trump's rhetorical energy. She did not hold press conferences where she waved her fist and made dramatic declarations. She did not play into the narrative that the Trump team wanted, which was a narrative about a strong America confronting a weak Mexico, about the hemisphere's dominant power reasserting control over a neighbor that had been getting away with too much for too long. She refused that narrative, calmly, consistently, almost relentlessly. Instead, she made her arguments in the language of mutual economic interest. She made her arguments by pointing to data, actual data about American jobs, American exports, American agricultural revenues that depended on the continuation of a functioning trade relationship. She made the case not as a supplicant asking for mercy, but as a partner reminding the other side of what was at stake for both parties. And this approach worked not because it was philosophically appealing, not because Trump's team had some sudden conversion to multilateralist economics, but because the underlying reality it described was true. The data she was pointing to was real. The economic interdependence she was describing was real. And at a certain point, reality has a way of asserting itself even in the most politically charged environments. But let's not be naive about this either. Let's not tell a story where enlightened argument wins the day and that's the end of it, because that is not how power works, and we should be more honest than that. What actually shifted the balance, what actually pushed Trump toward the reversal, was not just the persuasiveness of Sheinbaum's economic arguments, it was political pressure from within the United States itself. It was Republican senators from agricultural states getting calls from farmers and food processors and export dependent businesses who were looking at the tariff proposals and doing their own math. It was the automobile industry lobby, which is one of the most powerful in American politics, making its concerns known through every channel available to it. It was the financial markets doing what financial markets do, reacting to the uncertainty created by the tariff threats in ways that registered in portfolios and investment portfolios, and the kind of economic indicators that the Trump administration could not entirely ignore even when it wanted to. It was, in other words, capitalism pushing back on a policy that was bad for capitalism, which is one of those genuinely interesting moments in political economy where the internal contradictions of the system become briefly visible. Trump had positioned himself as the champion of American business. American business, or at least large chunks of it, was telling him that this particular expression of that championship was hurting them. And that message, delivered through the appropriate channels with the appropriate intensity, had effect. Now, I want to dwell on what this deal actually means, what Sheinbaum actually secured, because the details matter and the details are telling. This wasn't a situation where Mexico made symbolic concessions on border security and immigration in exchange for tariff relief. The kind of deal where both sides declare victory and the underlying power dynamics remain entirely unchanged. What was negotiated here had real substance on the economic side. There were commitments around investment frameworks, around supply chain cooperation, around agricultural trade that reflected Mexican interests in ways that previous iterations of the US Mexico economic relationship had often not. There were provisions that acknowledged the nearshoring reality and created structures around it that would give Mexican workers and the Mexican state more capacity to capture value from that manufacturing investment rather than simply providing the labor while the profits flowed elsewhere. These are not revolutionary changes. I want to be clear about that because I have no interest in overstating what happened here. The fundamental structure of the relationship, a relationship that was built over decades in ways that serve the interests of capital over labor, that built in dependencies and asymmetries that don't disappear with a single round of negotiations. That structure is still there. But within that structure, the margins shifted. And in economic relationships between nations, margins matter enormously. Margins compound over time. Margins accumulate into structural changes that eventually become impossible to ignore. What I find most interesting about this moment, and this is where I want to spend some time because I think it connects to something much larger, is what it reveals about the current global moment we are living through. We are at a point where the post-World War II international order, the order built around American dominance and the institutions that American dominance created and staffed and largely controlled is under genuine stress, not collapsing. I'm not one of those commentators who is always announcing the end of American empire because it makes for dramatic television, but genuinely structurally stressed. And one of the most important symptoms of that stress is what we might call the increasing assertiveness of what used to be called the periphery. Countries that were for decades expected to accept the terms offered to them by the dominant powers of the global economy, to take the trade deals that were put in front of them, to implement the structural adjustment programs that the IMF and World Bank prescribed, to manage their currencies and their fiscal policies in ways that served the interests of global finance rather than their own populations. Those countries are, in different ways and at different speeds and with very different degrees of success, starting to push back, not in a coordinated way, not as part of some grand ideological movement, but as a series of individual national decisions made by governments that are reading the room and concluding that the room has changed, that the leverage has shifted, even if only modestly, that the moment is different from what it was. Mexico under Sheinbaum is part of this story. So is Brazil under Lula, navigating its own complicated relationship with American economic and political pressure. So is the broader BRICS expansion, however imperfect and contradictory it may be in practice. So is the quiet but steady effort by multiple countries in the global south to reduce their dependence on dollar-denominated trade and finance, not because any of them have found a viable alternative tomorrow, but because the direction of travel has changed, because the calculation about whether to invest in diversifying away from that dependence has shifted in ways that make the investment more appealing than it was a decade ago. And what Trump's reversal on Mexico illustrates is that these shifts have real consequences even within the hemisphere that American power has historically treated as its most secure sphere of influence. If the United States cannot simply impose its will on Mexico, its immediate neighbor, its NAFTA USMCA partner, the country whose economy is perhaps more intertwined with America's than any other on earth, then the notion that American economic nationalism can simply roll over every other consideration everywhere else in the world becomes even harder to sustain. I also want to talk about what this means domestically in Mexico because I think that dimension gets lost in the international coverage. For Sheinbaum, this deal is not just a diplomatic achievement, it is a political one. She came into office with enormous expectations built partly on the legacy of Lopez Obrador and the political movement he created, expectations about what a left nationalist government in Mexico could actually deliver for working people, for communities that had been left behind by the neoliberal era, for the millions of Mexicans whose relationship with the United States had been defined for so long by migration and remittances and the kind of desperate economic necessity that comes from being on the wrong side of a deeply unequal relationship. And the pressure that Trump had been applying, the tariff threats, the immigration enforcement rhetoric, the general posture of treating Mexico as a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be engaged, that pressure was landing on real people. It was creating uncertainty in communities that depended on the manufacturing investment that nearshoring had brought. It was threatening the livelihoods of workers in export industries. It was generating exactly the kind of economic anxiety that can destabilize governments and fracture political coalitions. By navigating this successfully, by being able to go back to the Mexican public and say we sat across the table from the most powerful government in the world and we did not give away what we needed to protect, Sheinbaum strengthens herself domestically in ways that will matter for everything that comes after. The political capital that comes from being seen as someone who defends your country's interests effectively against external pressure, that is enormously valuable. It is the kind of thing that gives a government room to maneuver room to pursue the domestic agenda that is ultimately more important than any single round of trade negotiations. And now let's come back to Trump, because his side of this story is also worth understanding carefully, even if it is less flattering. What happened here is not simply that Trump was outmaneuvered by a smarter negotiator, though there is some truth to that. What happened is that the policy logic that his team had constructed, the logic that said tariffs would produce quick, visible victories that could be presented to his base as proof of his effectiveness, ran into the actual complexity of the economic world, and the actual complexity won. This is a recurring pattern. It's a pattern that anyone who watched the first term would recognize. The enormous distance between the rhetoric of economic nationalism and the reality of what the American economy actually is, globally integrated, deeply dependent on trade and investment flows, and supply chains that cross every border that nationalist politicians want to treat as clean lines of demarcation. That distance has a way of generating exactly these kinds of reversals. Not because Trump's team is uniquely incompetent, though there are certainly arguments to be made on that front, but because the gap between the story and the reality is so large that even the most aggressive use of political will cannot simply bridge it by declaration. What this means going forward is uncertain, and I want to be honest about that uncertainty. One reversal does not establish a pattern. One successful negotiation by Sheinbaum does not transform the structural relationship between the United States and Mexico, or between the United States and the broader global South. The forces that generate these pressures, the political constituencies in the United States that respond to economic anxiety by supporting nationalist economic policies, the structural inequalities of the global economy that give rich countries enormous leverage, even when that leverage is being used imperfectly, those forces do not disappear because of a single diplomatic episode. There will be more confrontations, there will be more tariff threats and more political theater and more moments where smaller and less powerful countries have to make decisions about how much to accommodate and how much to resist. And the outcomes of those confrontations will not always look like what happened here, but what happened here does establish something. It establishes that resistance is not futile, that the leverage of the United States is real but not unlimited, that a government with a clear sense of its own interests, with a sophisticated understanding of where the other side's economic vulnerabilities actually lie, with the political discipline to stay on message and not be baited into confrontations it doesn't need to have, can achieve outcomes that are meaningfully better than simply accepting whatever terms are offered. That is not a small thing. In a world where the dominant narrative about countries in Mexico's position has for so long been about dependency and vulnerability and the inevitability of accommodation, demonstrating that a different outcome is possible has value that extends well beyond the specific terms of this specific deal. And that is why I keep coming back to the figure of Scheinbaum in this story, not as a hero in some simple celebratory sense, but as an example of what politically serious governance actually looks like. She took seriously the structural constraints she was operating within. She took seriously the economic interdependence that defines her country's relationship with its northern neighbor. She did not pretend those constraints didn't exist. She did not play to the gallery with nationalist rhetoric that would have felt good in the moment, but would have made the actual negotiation harder. She worked with reality as it is, not as she might have wished it to be, and she found within that reality more room to maneuver than the conventional wisdom would have suggested was there. That is, in my view, what political leadership actually looks like when it's working, not the performance of strength, not the theatrical assertion of will, but the disciplined, clear-eyed identification of where your leverage actually exists and the strategic patience to use it at the right moment in the right way. Trump buckled. Scheinbaum sealed the deal, and the world quietly is a little different than it was before. not transformed, not revolutionized, but different, and in the long, slow work of changing the terms on which the global economy operates, terms that have for too long been set entirely by a small number of powerful actors in ways that serve a small number of powerful interests. Different matters. Different is where everything begins.